One bite. That is all it takes to cement a legacy or erase a bloodline in the gilded halls where Chicago's crime families break bread. At Ristorante Il Destino, loyalty is supposed to be the only ingredient that matters. But for Alicia Gomez, a waitress drowning in her mother's medical bills and trying to stay beneath the radar, that one bite came with a texture. Not the creamy richness of aged parmesan or the tender pull of braised veal, but the fine, crystalline shimmer of something that had no place on osso buco. She didn't know the bearded man was Dante Vivaldi. She didn't know the lion tattooed on his right hand made him the city's next king. She only knew that if that fork reached his lips, the heir would die at his own father's table. This is the story of the night a slap shattered the silence, and a waitress became the only thing standing between a son and his father's betrayal. Right before we begin, I want to know where you are listening from down below in the comment section. Let's start. The chandeliers of Ristorante. Il Destino cast amber light across white tablecloths like a benediction, but Alicia Gomez knew better than to mistake elegance for safety. She'd been weaving through these tables for 6 months now, long enough to recognize the men who didn't need to raise their voices to command a room. Long enough to know that the private alcove in the back, the one with the velvet curtains and the view of the kitchen, was where power came to dine on Sunday nights. Her feet ached in the regulation black flats. Her mother's latest hospital bill sat folded in her apron pocket like a lead weight. The numbers burned into her memory. $3,478. The cost of keeping someone alive while your own life slowly suffocated under the debt. She balanced the tray of osso buco with practiced grace. The braised veal shanks glistening under their sauce, bone marrow pooling in the center of each crosscut like liquid gold. The murmur of Italian and English blended with the soft strings of Puccini floating from hidden speakers. Alicia approached the Vivaldi table, her smile fixed in the pleasant neutrality she'd perfected. Not too warm, not too cold. Invisible. That was the trick to surviving in a place like this. Be the wallpaper, be the background music, be anything but memorable. Don Vittorio Vivaldi sat at the head of the table like a Renaissance painting come to life. Silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome before it had been carved into something harder. His suit probably cost more than Alicia made in a year. He raised a crystal glass of Barolo, the wine catching the light like blood. To my son, the Don's voice carried the weight of old-world authority, who will carry our name into the future with the strength it deserves. Across from him, Dante Vivaldi nodded, his dark beard neatly trimmed, his eyes the color of espresso. When he reached for his own glass, Alicia caught the flash of ink across his right hand, a lion's head, mane flowing across his knuckles in exquisite detail. The mark of the heir. She'd seen it before when she'd served their table, but tonight something about the way his father watched him made her skin prickle. She set down the first plate in front of Don Vittorio with steady hands, then moved to Dante's place setting. The second dish landed with the softest clink of porcelain on wood. The veal shank looked perfect, the gremolata garnish bright green against the rich brown sauce. And yet, Alicia's hand hesitated over the plate. Her nursing school reflexes, the ones she'd spent 2 years and $40,000 developing before her mother's illness, had pulled her out, fired like a warning shot. The white powder dusted across the meat's surface. Too fine, too uniform. Parmesan cheese had texture, character, the rough grain of something aged. This looked like it had been sifted through silk. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She thought of Dr. Reeves's voice in Toxicology 201, droning on about contact poisons while half the class dozed in the back row. She thought of the crystalline compounds that could stop a heart in minutes, the ones that dissolved on the tongue and left nothing but a corpse and confusion. Dante reached for his fork, his lion-marked hand moving with casual confidence. Don Vittorio watched over the rim of his wine glass, and there, just there, Alicia caught it, the briefest flicker in the old man's eyes. Not concern, not love, anticipation. The fork lifted, the tines speared the veal. Dante smiled at something his father said, the words lost in the sudden rushing of blood in Alicia's ears. She saw the future in the space of a breath, the fork rising, the lips parting, the powder touching tongue and palate, the collapse, the screaming, the sirens that would come too late. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. Alicia's hand shot out and slapped the fork from Dante's grip with enough force to send it spinning across the table. It clattered against Don Vittorio's wine glass, and the entire restaurant fell into a silence so profound she could hear the hiss of the meat as it hit the floor. Where it landed, the varnish on the hardwood began to bubble, a small circle of corruption spreading like a stain. Every eye in Ristorante Il Destino turned to witness a waitress standing over the city's next king, her hand still raised, her chest heaving, and the scattered remains of his last meal smoking at their feet. Dante's eyes met hers, wide with shock and something else, the dawning recognition that she had just saved his life, or started a war. Perhaps both. Dante's fist hit the mahogany with the force of a gavel, and the sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. 6 men in dark suits rose as one, their movements synchronized by years of violent choreography. Alicia saw the glint of steel, heard the whisper of metal clearing leather, and suddenly she was staring down the barrels of enough firepower to end her story before it truly began. Her hands went up instinctively, the universal language of surrender, but her voice stayed steady. Training from a life spent in emergency rooms and lecture halls kept her focused, even as her pulse hammered against her throat. "The floor," she said, her words cutting through the tension. "Look at the floor." No one moved. The guns didn't waver. Dante's jaw worked beneath his beard, his espresso eyes dark with something between rage and confusion. His lion-marked hand flexed on the table's edge, and for a moment, Alicia wondered if she'd miscalculated everything, if the white powder had been nothing more than poorly grated cheese, and her paranoia had just signed her death warrant. Then Dante's gaze dropped to where his ossobuco lay scattered across the polished hardwood. The varnish continued its slow dissolution, the finish lifting in tiny bubbles that popped and released the faintest trace of something acrid into the air. The bone marrow that had pooled so beautifully on the plate now ate into the wood like acid into flesh. Where the white powder had concentrated, a small crater was forming, the chemical reaction undeniable even to those without medical training. "Cristo," Dante breathed. His hand moved to his throat in an unconscious gesture, as if checking that he could still swallow, still breathe. The realization hit him with visible force. He had been seconds from putting that in his mouth, seconds from whatever agonizing death that powder promised. Alicia watched his face transform, watched the shock give way to the cold calculation of a man raised in violence. He turned to his father with the slowness of a predator reassessing its territory. "Papa?" Don Vittorio's expression remained carved from granite, but his knuckles had gone white around his wine glass. "An accident," he said, his voice smooth as the Barolo he'd toasted with. "Someone in the kitchen made a terrible mistake. We will find out who—" "Kill her!" The words came fast, too fast, cutting across his own measured explanation. Don Vittorio's other hand sliced through the air toward Alicia like he was swatting a fly. Kill her now. She has attacked my son in front of everyone. This disrespect cannot stand." The command hung in the perfumed air of the restaurant, and Alicia felt the shift in the room like a drop in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The guns that had been pointed at her in defensive posture suddenly acquired intent, the men behind them leaning forward with the eagerness of hounds released. But Dante's hand shot up, palm out, and the gesture froze them mid-motion. The lion across his knuckles seemed to snarl in the chandelier light. "Wait!" It was a single word, but it carried the weight of the authority Don Vittorio had just toasted to, the heir speaking with the voice he would need to command the family. The guns didn't lower, but they didn't fire either, caught in the tension between the old king and the new. Dante stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and Alicia saw the pieces clicking together behind his eyes. She saw the moment he realized what she'd already understood, that a father's first instinct should have been gratitude toward the woman who saved his son, not execution. That the Don's rage had come too quickly, with too much certainty, as if the script had already been written and she'd just ruined his final act. Why? Dante's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the restaurant, it carried to every corner. He wasn't asking his father why Alicia should die. He was asking why he himself was supposed to. Don Vittorio's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, the briefest flash of a hunter whose prey had sensed the trap. "You're confused, figlio mio. The shock. Answer me." Dante took a step toward his father, and the lion on his hand curled into a fist. "She saves my life, and you want her dead before anyone can explain what that poison was or how it got on my plate?" Another step. "Before I can thank her? Before I can ask questions?" The restaurant held its breath. Even the music seemed to fade, Puccini's strings dying away to nothing. "That girl," Dante said, his voice hardening into something Alicia recognized from her months serving these tables, the sound of a made man declaring war. "Just saved me from someone at this table, and you want to silence her before she can tell me who." Dante's hand closed around Alicia's wrist like a manacle. And then the world became motion. He yanked her behind him as the first gunshot shattered a wine bottle on the wall where her head had been a heartbeat before. Glass and Barolo exploded in a crimson spray that looked too much like the real thing, and then they were running. The kitchen doors burst open under Dante's shoulder, and they plunged into a world of steam and fire, and the smell of garlic so thick it coated the back of Alicia's throat. Chefs in white coats scattered like pigeons, their shouts of alarm mixing with the clatter of dropped pans and the hiss of flames beneath industrial burners. Alicia's feet slipped on the tile floor, slick with grease and spilled sauce, but Dante's grip kept her upright as he dragged her deeper into the labyrinth of stainless steel. Behind them, the kitchen doors slammed open again. Don Vittorio's men poured through like a dark tide, their suits incongruous among the chef's whites, their guns very much at home. A bullet sparked off a hanging pot rack, sending copper cookware swinging and clanging like demented church bells. "Down!" Dante shoved Alicia behind a prep station piled high with fresh pasta, and she hit the floor hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Above her, another shot punched through a pot of marinara, and the sauce erupted like a wound, thick red liquid cascading over the counter's edge and pooling around her knees. The heat of it seared through her black slacks. Dante moved with the efficiency of a man who'd been trained for violence since childhood. He grabbed a cast-iron skillet from a nearby burner, the handle wrapped hastily in a fallen apron, and swung it in a vicious arc that connected with the first gunman's temple. The man dropped like a puppet with cut strings, his weapon skittering across the tile. But there were more. always more. Alicia could see them fanning out through the kitchen, using the industrial equipment as cover, moving with the coordination of men who'd hunted prey through tighter spaces than this. Her nursing school brain catalogued exits with desperate speed, the main doors they'd come through, now blocked, the service entrance on the far side, 30 feet of open ground away, the walk-in freezer, a death trap with only one way out. "Chef Marcello!" Dante's voice cut through the chaos, and Alicia followed his gaze to a compact man in a stained white coat trying to slip out the back door. The chef froze, his hand on the exit bar, and the guilt on his face told the entire story before he could manufacture a lie. Dante vaulted over a stainless steel counter with liquid grace, landing between the chef and freedom. "You cooked my last meal," he said, and the words carried a weight that made even the gunman pause. "Who paid you?" Chef Marcello's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the steam from the pots still boiling on their burners. "Signor Vivaldi, Which Signor Vivaldi?" Dante's hand shot out and fisted in the chef's collar, slamming him back against the door. "Answer carefully. Your life depends on it." A bullet answered instead, punching through a bag of flour on the shelf above them. White powder exploded in a cloud that filled the air like fog, and in that moment of reduced visibility, Dante made his choice. He drove his knee into the chef's stomach with brutal precision, caught the man's phone as it tumbled from his pocket, and then he was moving again, back toward where Alicia crouched behind her fortress of pasta. "Can you run?" he asked, his voice urgent but somehow steady, and she nodded even though her legs felt like water. He hauled her up with one hand, the chef's phone clutched in the other, and they were sprinting for the back exit. The kitchen erupted behind them. Someone hit the fire suppression system, and suddenly water was raining down from the ceiling, mixing with oil and sauce to create a treacherous slick. Alicia heard cursing in Italian and English, heard the crash of a body hitting the floor, but she didn't look back. Dante kicked open the service door and they burst into the alley where the night air hit her lungs like ice after the inferno of the kitchen. A delivery truck idled against the loading dock, its engine running, the driver nowhere to be seen, probably inside collecting his tip, unaware that his Sunday night was about to get complicated. Dante didn't hesitate. He pulled Alicia toward the cab, wrenched open the passenger door, and shoved her inside. "You know how to drive?" he asked, already moving around to the driver's side. "Yes, but good. Because in about 10 seconds, I'm going to need you to." He fired up the engine properly and threw the truck into gear just as Don Vittorio's men spilled into the alley, their weapons raised, their faces twisted with fury. The truck lurched forward with a diesel roar, and Alicia grabbed the dashboard as Dante aimed them toward the narrow mouth of the alley, like a missile toward its target. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness behind them, and she heard the distinctive ping of bullets against metal. But then they were on the street, merging into the flow of Chicago traffic. Two people covered in marinara and flour, fleeing a father's betrayal in a stolen bread truck that smelled like rosemary and imminent death. The delivery truck's headlights cut through the Chicago night as Dante navigated side streets with the instinct of a man who knew which routes the police avoided. Alicia watched the rearview mirror for pursuit, her heart still hammering from the kitchen firefight, marinara sauce drying stiff on her clothes like stage blood. They'd made it 6 blocks before Dante's right hand slipped on the steering wheel. "Merda," he muttered, flexing his fingers with visible effort. The lion tattoo seemed to ripple across his knuckles as the muscles beneath it struggled to respond. He gripped the wheel tighter, overcompensating, but Alicia saw the tremor that ran through his forearm. "Pull over," she said immediately. "We need distance. They'll have every soldier in the family looking for—" "Pull over now." The command in her voice surprised even her, but it was the tone she'd learned in clinical rotations, the voice that cut through panic and pain to reach the lizard brain that wanted to survive. "You're showing symptoms." Dante's jaw clenched, but he guided the truck into the gravel lot of a shuttered gas station. The kind of place where weeds pushed through cracked concrete and the pumps had been dark for years. He killed the engine and turned to face her, and in the glow of a distant streetlight, she could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cold night air. "It's just adrenaline," he said, but his right hand was curled against his thigh now, the fingers contracting involuntarily. Alicia was already reaching for him, her fingers finding his wrist and counting the pulse. Fast but steady. Not shock, not yet. "Which hand held the fork?" "What?" "At the table. Which hand were you using? Show me." Dante lifted his right hand slowly, and Alicia saw it then, the faint discoloration on his palm and fingertips, a subtle redness that could have been mistaken for irritation, but carried the wrong pattern. Not uniform. Concentrated where flesh had pressed against metal. "Binary compound," she breathed, the pieces clicking together with the terrible clarity of a diagnosis confirmed. God, he was thorough. The powder on the meat was only part of it. The fork handle was coated with the catalyst. Dante stared at his hand like it belonged to someone else. "I don't understand. 2-part poison. Neither component is lethal alone, but when they mix..." Alicia was already digging through her apron pockets, inventorying the meager supplies of a waitress who used to be a nursing student. Pen, order pad, the folded hospital bill, a book of matches. Nothing useful. Nothing that could stop a neurotoxin from spreading through his bloodstream. "How long have you had numbness?" "Since the kitchen. Maybe 5 minutes." 5 minutes. The compound was already in his system, crawling toward his heart and lungs with chemical inevitability. Alicia's mind raced through treatment protocols she'd memorized for exams she never finished taking. Activated charcoal for ingestion, useless here. Atropine for certain nerve agents, which she didn't have. Epinephrine to buy time, also absent. She looked at Dante's hand again, at the point of absorption, and made a decision that would have gotten her expelled from any medical program in the country. "I need your knife," she said. Dante's left hand moved to his ankle without question, producing a blade that caught the streetlight like a sliver of moon. He handed it to her handle first, and she saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. "You're going to cut it out. I'm going to stop it from spreading." Alicia pushed open the passenger door and dropped to the gravel. "Come here. Bring the emergency kit from behind the seat." They worked by the light of the truck's dome lamp, Dante producing a roadside safety kit that contained a flare, reflective triangles, and a first aid pouch with butterfly bandages that would be laughably inadequate. Alicia cracked the flare and jammed it into the gravel, the red light painting them both in hellish tones. "This is going to hurt," she said, which was the understatement of his life, and possibly the end of it if she miscalculated. "The toxin entered through your palm. I need to cauterize the absorption site before it reaches your major vessels." Dante braced his right hand against the truck's bumper, palm up. The lion tattoo stretching across his knuckles like it was roaring defiance at death itself. "Do it!" Alicia held the knife blade in the flare's flame until the metal glowed angry orange. Her hands didn't shake, couldn't shake, not now, not when a life depended on the training she'd abandoned and the instincts she'd never lost. She met Dante's eyes once, saw the trust there that she hadn't earned but would have to honor, and then she pressed the heated blade against his palm. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, primal and nauseating. Dante's body went rigid, his left hand fisting in the gravel. But he didn't pull away, didn't scream, just breathed through clenched teeth as Alicia methodically sealed the tissue where the poison had entered, destroying the pathway it needed to travel deeper. She worked with the precision of a surgeon and the desperation of a woman who'd already watched too many people die in hospital beds while she stood helpless. When she finally pulled the knife away, Dante's palm was a ruin of blistered tissue and cauterized flesh. The lion tattoo across his knuckles now bled into a scar that would never fully heal, the mane's edge forever distorted by the mark of his father's betrayal. Alicia wrapped his hand in the pathetic bandages from the kit, her fingers gentle despite the violence she'd just committed. "We need to get you to a hospital." "No hospitals?" Dante's voice was rough with pain, but absolutely certain. "They'll find us there. But you..." He looked at her with something between awe and horror. "You just saved my life. Again." The Stardust Motel squatted on the edge of nowhere. The kind of place where questions cost extra, and nobody looked at faces too closely. Alicia paid cash from Dante's wallet, while he sat slumped in the truck's passenger seat, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest like a wounded animal. The clerk barely glanced up from his magazine, sliding a key across the counter with the bored efficiency of a man who'd seen everything and remembered nothing. Room 12 smelled like cigarette smoke, and industrial cleaner trying to mask sins that had soaked into the carpet decades ago. Dante moved to the bed and sat heavily on the edge, his suit jacket streaked with flour and marinara, his face grey beneath his beard. Alicia locked the door, threw the chain, and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Old habits from her mother's neighborhood, where safety was something you built yourself. "It doesn't make sense," Dante said finally, his voice hollow. He stared at his ruined hand, at the bandages already seeping through with clear fluid from the burns. "My father has been grooming me to take over since I was 12 years old, teaching me the business, introducing me to the family's everything. Why would he..." His throat worked around words that wouldn't come. "It was Chef Marcello. He's worked for the Benedettis for years. This was them trying to start a war, to weaken us." Alicia turned from the window where she'd been checking the parking lot. "Your father ordered him killed on sight, before we could question him. To send a message, to show strength, to silence him." She crossed to where she'd dropped the chef's phone on the nightstand, the screen cracked but still functional. "Before he could tell you the truth." Dante's eyes tracked to the device like it was a coiled snake. "You don't know my father. He built this family from nothing after my grandfather was killed. He's ruthless, yes, but he's always put the family first. Always. I'm his only son, his heir. Without me, everything he's built..." "Look at the phone, Dante. It's probably coded. We won't be able to..." "Look at the phone." Alicia picked up the device and held it out to him, her hand steady, even though her heart was breaking for what he was about to discover. She'd already seen it while he was focused on driving, had scrolled through the messages with growing horror and the sick certainty that some betrayals were too calculated to be misunderstood. Dante took the phone with his left hand, his movements reluctant, like a man walking toward the gallows. The screen illuminated his face in cold blue light as he navigated to the messages. Alicia watched his eyes scan the texts, watched the exact moment he found the one from 3 hours ago, sent from a contact labeled only Papa V. His lips moved silently, reading words that rewrote his entire existence. "Make sure he doesn't leave the table. The follow-up, sent 20 minutes later. Use the secondary compound, primary on the meat, catalyst on the utensil. It must look like heart failure." The phone slipped from Dante's fingers and hit the stained carpet with a muffled thud. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat there with his bandaged hand pressed against his chest, and his good hand curled into a fist against his thigh. When he finally spoke, his voice came from somewhere far away, from a place Alicia couldn't follow. He thought I was weak. The words were barely a whisper. Last month, I told him we should move away from the protection rackets, focus on legitimate business, real estate, investments. He said, Dante's breath caught. He said the modern world required modern thinking, that he was proud of me for seeing the bigger picture. Alicia knelt in front of him, her hands hovering near his knees but not touching, giving him space to shatter. I'm sorry. He was lying. The whole time he was lying. Dante's voice cracked, and Alicia saw the son dying in real time, saw 28 years of trust and love and filial devotion bleeding out in a $30 motel room. He toasted me, in front of everyone, to my son, who will carry our name into the future with the strength it deserves. And the whole time he knew I'd be dead before dessert. The sound that came from Dante then was something between a sob and a growl, grief and rage twisting into something new. His left fist slammed into the nightstand hard enough to crack the cheap veneer, and when he lifted his face to look at Alicia, she saw that the man who'd walked into Ristorante Il Destino for a family dinner was gone. In his place sat someone harder, colder. The eyes that met hers held the flat certainty of a predator who'd learned that mercy was just another word for weakness, that family was just another weapon to be turned against you. He wanted me weak. Dante stood slowly, his movements controlled despite the pain that must be screaming through his hand. He wanted me soft. He wanted someone ruthless enough to lead. He picked up the chef's phone again, his thumb scrolling through the messages with methodical precision. Then I'll show him exactly what he created. The son was dead. Long live the Don. If you are enjoying this story, kindly like this video and hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. Dawn broke cold over the Chicago skyline, painting the city in shades of grey and gold that promised nothing. Alicia sat cross-legged on the motel bed with a road map spread before her, her finger tracing the route north to the Vivaldi vineyard, while Dante paced the narrow room like a caged animal. His bandaged hand hung at his side, the painkillers she'd convinced him to take doing little to ease the way he favored it. The antidote exists, he said for the third time, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. My father doesn't use poisons without keeping the cure close. It's insurance, control. He'd want to be able to reverse it if... He stopped himself, the unspoken words hanging heavy. If he changed his mind, if he needed leverage, if his son proved useful after all. Alicia looked up from the map. So it'll be at the vineyard? In the wine cellar? That's where he keeps everything that matters, the vintage collections, the financial records, the leverage files on every family in the city. Dante's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. And the chemistry set he's been playing with since I was a kid. He used to call it his hobby. I thought he meant the wine making. The poison was still in his system, slowed but not stopped by the crude cauterization. Alicia could see it in the way his pupils had started to dilate unevenly, in the tremor that occasionally ran through his left side now, spreading from the initial absorption point like ripples in dark water. They had maybe 24 hours before the neurotoxin found something critical to shut down. Maybe less. How many men guard the estate? She asked, pulling a notepad from her purse and starting a list with the methodical calm of someone planning a grocery run rather than an assault on a fortified crime family compound. 12 on rotation. More if Papa knows we're coming, which he will. He'll have every approach covered. The main gate, the service roads, the vineyard paths. Dante stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that mixed respect and disbelief. "You understand we're talking about breaking into the most secure private property in 3 counties to steal from a man who's already tried to kill me once. Twice, technically. The fork and the meat." Alicia kept writing, her pen scratching across paper as her nursing school brain shifted into the problem-solving mode that had gotten her through organic chemistry and trauma rotations. What kind of security system? Motion sensors on the perimeter, cameras at every entrance, reinforced doors that require key codes. And that's before you factor in the men with guns who are paid very well to shoot first and never bother with questions. Alicia chewed her lip, thinking. They had no weapons except Dante's knife, no backup, no resources beyond what they could carry and what she could improvise from whatever the universe provided. It should have been impossible, but impossible was just another word for a problem that hadn't been solved yet. "We need to go shopping," she said finally. 20 minutes later, they stood in a 24-hour discount store that smelled like cheap plastic and fluorescent desperation. Alicia pushed a cart through aisles of household goods, while Dante trailed behind her, his baseball cap pulled low, watching the exits with the paranoia of a hunted man. She loaded the cart with items that seemed random to anyone watching: bleach, ammonia, drain cleaner, pool shock, rubbing alcohol, road flares, zip ties, duct tape, a dozen glass bottles, and several large bags of fertilizer from the garden section. "You're building a bomb," Dante said quietly, as she added a funnel and latex gloves to the collection. "I'm building options." Alicia moved to the automotive section and grabbed battery acid and antifreeze. "Your father has numbers and training. We have chemistry and desperation. I spent 2 years learning what substances do to human tissue." She met his eyes over the cart loaded with innocent products that could be combined into a dozen different nightmares. "I'm about to teach those guards the same lessons." At the checkout, the clerk barely glanced at them, just scanned items with the dead-eyed efficiency of someone working the graveyard shift. Alicia paid cash again, and they loaded everything into the truck's cargo bed while the parking lot security cameras watched with mechanical indifference. Back in the truck, Alicia spread her notepad across the dashboard and started sketching. "We can't go through the front or they'll gun us down before we reach the gate. But vineyards need irrigation, which means underground pipes and access tunnels, and wine cellars need ventilation, which means external vents that can be breached." Dante studied her crude diagrams, and something like hope flickered across his face. "There's a drainage culvert that runs from the vineyard to the property line. We used to play in it as kids before Papa sealed the cellar entrance." "Sealed how?" "Steel grate. Padlocked." Alicia added drain cleaner to her mental recipe list. "Not for long. Tell me about the cellar layout, where he'd keep the antidote, how many exits, what we're walking into." As Dante described his father's underground sanctum, Alicia filled pages with notations and chemical formulas. Building a battle plan from household products and half-remembered lectures. She was a waitress who'd never finished her degree, and he was a mob heir poisoned by his own blood. And together they were about to wage war on an empire with nothing but improvised chemistry and the kind of desperate courage that came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. The Vivaldi vineyard rose from the Illinois countryside like something transplanted from Tuscany, all stone walls and terracotta roofs, visible even in the darkness. Alicia crouched beside Dante in the tree line, 200 yards from the main house, watching the sweep of searchlights cut through the night with mechanical precision. The estate sprawled across 40 acres of what had once been farmland, transformed by Don Vittorio's money and vision into a fortress disguised as wine country elegance. Dante's breathing had grown labored during the drive north, his pupils now visibly mismatched in size. The poison was winning its slow race toward his heart, and Alicia knew they were operating on borrowed time, measured in hours rather than days. She'd packed her improvised arsenal into a backpack that clinked softly with glass bottles, each one filled with chemical combinations that would have earned her expulsion from nursing school, and possibly a visit from federal authorities. "The culvert is 1/2 mile east," Dante whispered, his bandaged hand pressed against his ribs. "Past the new growth vines. Papa never bothered to upgrade security there because it leads nowhere useful. Or so he thinks." They moved through the vineyard like shadows, keeping low between rows of dormant vines that reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The earth was soft beneath Alicia's feet, rich with decades of cultivation, and she thought absurdly of all the family dinners that had been toasted with wine grown in this soil. All the celebrations and alliances sealed over bottles that cost more than her mother's medical bills. Blood and wine, she thought. The Vivaldis had always understood they were the same thing. The drainage culvert was exactly where Dante remembered, a concrete tube half buried in the hillside with a rusted grate that had been padlocked shut years ago. Alicia unslung her backpack and pulled out a bottle filled with a mixture of drain cleaner and aluminum foil scraps. The chemical reaction already generating heat that made the glass warm in her hands. She poured it carefully over the padlock's mechanism, and they watched as the acid ate through metal with a hiss that sounded too loud in the quiet night. The lock fell away in pieces. Dante wrenched the grate open with his good hand, the hinges screaming protest, and they dropped into darkness that smelled of mildew and old water. Alicia clicked on a penlight, its beam revealing a tunnel that stretched ahead into blackness, the walls slick with condensation and 30 years of neglect. They crawled through the dark with Dante leading the way from memory, his movements growing clumsier as the poison continued its work. Alicia kept one hand on his ankle, ready to catch him if he collapsed, her other hand clutching the backpack that had become their only weapon against impossible odds. The tunnel sloped downward, and after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, they reached the steel grate Dante had mentioned, the sealed entrance to the wine cellar. This lock was newer, more substantial, but Alicia had prepared for that. She mixed a more aggressive compound in a plastic container, adding pool shock to muriatic acid with the careful precision of someone who understood that chemistry was just controlled violence at the molecular level. The mixture began to smoke immediately, and she poured it over the grate's mounting points, watching the metal weep and buckle under the chemical assault. Dante kicked the grate once, twice, and on the third impact, it tore free from the wall with a groan that echoed through the tunnel. They emerged into the wine cellar like ghosts rising from the earth, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling racks of bottles that probably represented more wealth than Alicia would earn in a lifetime. The air here was climate-controlled, dry and cool, with the faint scent of oak and something sharper underneath, chemicals that didn't belong in a place dedicated to fermentation. The laboratory was hidden behind a false wall of wine racks, accessible through a door disguised as part of the shelving. Dante's fingers found the release mechanism automatically, muscle memory from a childhood spent exploring his father's secrets, and the door swung inward to reveal a space that looked like it belonged in a pharmaceutical facility rather than a family estate. Stainless steel tables, glass beakers and distillation equipment, locked refrigeration units labeled with codes that meant nothing to Alicia, but everything to someone who dealt in mortality. There, Dante pointed to a climate-controlled cabinet with his good hand, his voice slurred now with the toxins progress. That's where he keeps the active compounds and their counteragents. Alicia moved toward the cabinet, her fingers reaching for the handle, when she heard the unmistakable sound of a safety being released. Then another, and another. The lights blazed to full brightness, and she froze as 6 men materialized from positions they must have held in absolute silence. Behind the racks, in the shadows of the doorway, pressed against walls they'd blended into like predators in tall grass. They wore black tactical gear that marked them as something different from the restaurant soldiers, something more professional and infinitely more dangerous. Don Vittorio's elite guard, the men who handled problems that required more than intimidation. Each one held a weapon, trained with the steady calm of operators who'd done this work long enough to feel nothing about it. The last one through the door was Don Vittorio himself, dressed in a burgundy smoking jacket, like he'd just stepped away from an evening of brandy and opera rather than orchestrating his son's execution. He looked at Dante with an expression that might have been disappointment or might have been satisfaction. It was hard to tell which. "Figlio mio," the Don said softly, his voice carrying the weight of final judgments. "You should have died at dinner. This is just embarrassing for both of us." Alicia's hands went up slowly, the universal gesture of surrender, but her mind was already racing through the inventory of her backpack, still slung over one shoulder. 6 guards plus Don Vittorio made 7 targets in an enclosed space with limited ventilation. The wine cellar that had been designed to preserve expensive bottles was about to become a tomb unless she could turn those same preservation conditions into a weapon. "Papa!" Dante's voice was steady, despite the poison ravaging his system, despite the guns pointed at his chest. "You're making a mistake. My only mistake was waiting this long." Don Vittorio moved deeper into the laboratory, his hands clasped behind his back, like a professor addressing disappointing students. "I gave you every opportunity to prove yourself worthy of this family. Instead, you talked about legitimacy, about going clean, about turning the Vivaldi name into something respectable." He spat the last word like a curse. "Weakness, just like your mother." One of the guards shifted position, moving to flank Alicia from the left, and she let her eyes track around the laboratory with the careful assessment of someone cataloguing resources. The wine cellar beyond the false wall was stacked floor to ceiling with oak barrels, the traditional kind that wineries still used for aging premium vintages. Oak treated with sulfur dioxide to prevent bacterial contamination. Sulfur that, when combined with certain acids and introduced to a confined space, would create a gas that made breathing impossible. "The girl dies first," Don Vittorio continued, nodding toward Alicia with casual dismissal. "Then you, Dante. It will look like a murder-suicide. The waitress who became obsessed with you, who poisoned you at the restaurant, and then brought you here to finish the job. Tragic. But these things happen when weak men let their guard down." Alicia caught Dante's eyes and held them for a heartbeat, trying to communicate a plan that existed only in fragments and desperation. His slight nod told her he understood the most important part, that she was about to do something insane, and he needed to be ready to move when she did. "I need my inhaler," Alicia said suddenly, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. "I can't breathe. I have asthma. Please, it's in my bag." Don Vittorio's expression didn't change. "Shoot her." But Alicia was already moving, dropping to her knees and swinging the backpack around with the motion, her hands diving inside, not for an inhaler that didn't exist, but for the bottles she'd prepared for exactly this kind of impossible situation. Her fingers closed around glass, and she hurled the first bottle at the nearest oak barrel with all the strength her waitress arms had built, carrying trays through dinner rush. The bottle shattered against the wood, and the mixture inside, concentrated sulfuric acid from battery fluid mixed with aluminum, began its violent reaction immediately. She threw 2 more bottles in rapid succession at different barrels, then grabbed the bag of pool shock and ripped it open. scattering white granules across the floor where her acid mixtures were already eating through the barrel wood and releasing the sulfur dioxide used in the wine preservation process. The chemical reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Thick white smoke began billowing from the floor, a choking cloud that turned the air into knives in the lungs. Alicia had already pulled her shirt up over her nose and mouth, had already dropped flat to the ground, where the heavier gases would rise above her, leaving a thin layer of breathable air near the floor. The guards weren't so prepared. The first one to inhale the sulfur dioxide mixture went down, gagging, his weapon clattering against stone. Another stumbled backward into a wine rack, bottles crashing around him as he clawed at his throat. Don Vittorio was shouting orders that nobody could hear over their own choking, and then Dante was moving through the chaos like violence given form. He grabbed the fallen guard's weapon with his good hand and drove the stock into another guard's temple in the same motion. The laboratory had become hell-rendered in white smoke and desperate gasping, and Alicia used the confusion to crawl toward the climate-controlled cabinet where the antidote waited. Her eyes streamed tears from the chemical exposure, her own lungs burning despite the shirt pressed to her face. But she could see the vials through the smoke, rows of clear liquid labeled with codes that meant death or salvation, depending on which one she chose. A hand grabbed her ankle, and she kicked backward hard, felt the satisfying impact of her heel connecting with flesh. She wrenched open the cabinet door and grabbed every vial she could reach, stuffing them into her pockets without time to read labels or verify contents. Behind her she heard gunshots, heard Dante's roar of rage or pain or both, heard Don Vittorio screaming for his men to kill them both. But the smoke had reduced the world to immediate survival, and the vials clutched in her shaking hands. "Dante!" she screamed into the chemical fog. "Go! Get out!" She saw his silhouette moving through the smoke toward the door that led to the main house, saw him stumble and catch himself against the wall. Alicia followed on hands and knees, her backpack abandoned, her lungs screaming for clean air that didn't exist in this poisoned space. They burst through the door into a stone corridor that led upward, and she could hear the guards behind them, still choking, still struggling, but beginning to recover as the smoke dispersed into the larger cellar. Dante was already climbing the stairs toward the main house, toward his father's office where the real power resided, where the files and records and secrets that controlled an empire waited for someone strong enough to claim them. Alicia followed with the antidote vials clutched against her chest like fragile prayers, hoping desperately that she'd grabbed the right one, that they would survive long enough to find out. The office at the top of the estate had witnessed 3 generations of Vivaldi power, and now it would witness the death of one era and the brutal birth of another. Dante kicked open the mahogany doors with his shoulder, the stolen gun in his left hand and his right hand, burned, bandaged, bearing the scarred remnants of his lion tattoo, pressed against his ribs where the poison had begun to attack his diaphragm. Each breath came harder than the last, but he was still breathing, still moving, still alive, despite everything his father had engineered. Don Vittorio stood behind his desk with the calm of a man who'd orchestrated 1,000 violent acts and emerged unscathed from all of them. The old wolf in his den, surrounded by oil paintings of Vivaldi patriarchs and floor-to-ceiling shelves holding ledgers that documented decades of blood and profit. A decanter of wine sat on the desk between them. A 1947 Barolo, Alicia noted, as she stumbled through the door behind Dante, the kind of vintage that cost more than most people's houses. "You made it," Don Vittorio said, almost conversationally. "I underestimated the waitress. I won't make that mistake when I kill her." "You won't get the chance." Dante's voice was ragged but certain, the gun steady, despite the tremor running through his arm. Alicia could see the poison's progression, written across his body, the way his left leg had started to drag, the dilation of his pupils now severe enough to make his eyes look black in the office's lamplight. They had minutes, not hours. Don Vittorio poured himself a glass of the Barolo, with hands that didn't shake, the wine catching the light like liquid rubies. You need a waitress to fight your battles. You need a woman with a chemistry set to breach my home. And you think this makes you strong enough to lead? He lifted the glass in a mock toast. You think the families will respect a man who hides behind a girl's skirts? I think, Dante said, moving closer to the desk, that I was strong enough to survive my own father's betrayal. I think I was smart enough to see the poison you couldn't hide. And I think the families will respect a man who knows the difference between strength and cruelty. Alicia was already pulling the vials from her pockets with shaking hands, holding them up to the light to read the labels through her tears and the residual chemical burns that blurred her vision. The codes meant nothing. V7, V12, V23. Just alphanumeric sequences that could save Dante's life or stop his heart depending on which one she chose. She thought of her toxicology professor, of the lessons about antidotes and how they worked by blocking receptor sites or collating the poison before it could complete its deadly work. Binary compound, she reminded herself. 2-part poison needed a 2-part cure. The problem with your generation, Don Vittorio continued, swirling the wine in his glass, is that you think mercy is a virtue. But mercy is just another word for weakness, and weakness gets you killed in this world. I built this family on strength, on the understanding that sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. You built this family on fear, Dante corrected, his gun arm beginning to shake now as the poison attacked the nerves that controlled his muscles. And fear only lasts until someone stops being afraid. Don Vittorio's expression hardened. Then let me teach you one final lesson about fear. Figlio mio. His hand moved with surprising speed for a man his age, pulling a pistol from the desk drawer with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before, who'd shot men in this very office and had the carpet cleaned afterward. But Dante was faster. Or perhaps the poison had finally worked its way fully into Don Vittorio's wine glass, the residue from his own laboratory transferred there by hands that had mixed too many deadly compounds without proper caution. The old man's finger tightened on the trigger as his face went slack, his eyes widening in the horrible recognition that he'd made a fatal error somewhere in his meticulous planning. The gun fell from his fingers and clattered on the desk as he grabbed at his throat, the wine glass shattering on the floor in a spreading pool that looked too much like blood. Don Vittorio Vivaldi collapsed into his leather chair, the patriarch who'd built an empire on calculated violence undone by his own carelessness, with the very poisons he'd wielded against his son. His last breath rattled in his chest as he stared at Dante with something that might have been pride or might have been rage. It was impossible to tell which, and in the end it didn't matter. Alicia jammed the needle into Dante's thigh and pressed the plunger, administering the antidote she'd chosen through desperate intuition and half-remembered lessons about receptor antagonists. V12. She'd picked it because 12 had been her mother's lucky number, because sometimes survival came down to faith rather than science, because she was a waitress playing doctor in a crime lord's office, and all she had left was hope. Dante's body convulsed once, violently, and then his breathing eased. The color began to return to his face in slow degrees, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had been dark too long. 3 weeks later, Alicia stood on the stone balcony of the Vivaldi estate and watched the families gather in the vineyard below. They'd come from Chicago and New York, from Detroit and Philadelphia, all the major players in the careful ecosystem of organized crime that the Vivaldis had helped build. They'd come to witness the ascension of a new Don, to see if Dante Vivaldi was strong enough to hold his father's throne, or if the empire would fracture into civil war. She wore a black dress that actually fit her now, purchased with money from an account Dante had opened in her name, enough to pay every medical bill her mother had accumulated and fund the nursing degree she'd never finished. But she wasn't going back to school. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because the man standing in the vineyard receiving the ring that marked him as the new head of the family needed someone he could trust, absolutely. And trust was a currency even rarer than fear in this world. Dante looked up at the balcony, his scarred right hand catching the sunlight, the lion tattoo now bisected by the burn she'd given him to save his life. He raised a glass of wine. Not the Barolo his father had died drinking, but a newer vintage, something without poison or history or the weight of betrayal. He was waiting for her to descend, to take her place beside him, not as a waitress or a nurse, but as something this world had never seen before. A woman who'd saved a king and earned the right to stand in his court. Alicia picked up the decanter she'd been holding and moved toward the stairs. She was the only one he trusted to pour his wine, and she was the only one who knew which vials to keep close in case someone else decided that mercy looked like weakness. The families watched her approach with wary respect, this woman who'd stopped a fork mid-air and started a revolution. And as she filled Dante's glass with steady hands that no longer shook, she thought of the hospital bill that had been folded in her apron that night at Ristorante Il Destino, the $3,478 that had felt like the weight of the world. She'd paid it in full. The world cost more than she'd expected, but somehow, impossibly, she'd found a way to afford it. Here is the moral of the story. In the end, don't eat teaches us that true strength isn't found in ruthlessness or the willingness to betray those closest to us. It's found in the courage to act when others freeze, in the wisdom to recognize danger others overlook, and in the integrity to save a life even when it costs you everything. Alicia's instinct to protect rather than ignore, her refusal to stay invisible when action was required, transformed her from a struggling waitress into the most powerful ally a king could have. Meanwhile, Don Vittorio's fatal flaw wasn't his cruelty. It was his inability to see that compassion and strength aren't opposites, but partners. The old Don confused fear with respect and mercy with weakness, and that blindness cost him his empire and his life. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the person serving your dinner, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is slap a fork out of someone's hand, even when the whole world is watching. If you enjoyed this thrilling journey from the dining room to the Don's throne, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people discover stories where waitresses become warriors and poison meets its match. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of suspense, survival, and the unexpected heroes who change everything with a single choice. And comment below. Would you have had the courage to slap that fork? What would you have done in Alicia's position? Let's discuss in the comments. I read every single one and love hearing your thoughts. See you in the next story, where ordinary people face extraordinary choices. Until then, stay sharp, stay suspicious, and always check your food for strange white powder. You never know when your instincts might save a life or start a war.